Well, we are going to be continuing on our series of great Bible events. And when we talk about great Bible events, today I've titled the message, and I want to talk about the greatest miracle of all. Now, we're going to be in a story, and I'm going to read here in a second the story of some miracles that happened in the early church. But as we get around to the end of the message, I will focus on what I consider to be the greatest miracle of all. If you would, turn with me to the book of Acts, chapter 9, and I'm going to start reading from there in verse 32. We'll read a couple stories of a couple of different miracles here that Jesus Christ performed through the person of Peter. Like I said, in chapter 9, starting in verse 32. And it came to pass, as Peter passed throughout all quarters, he came down also to the saints which dwelt at Lydda. And there he found a certain man named Aeneas, which had kept his bed 8 years, and was sick of the palsy. And Peter said unto him, Aeneas, as Jesus Christ maketh thee whole, arise and make thy bed. And he arose immediately. And all that dwelt at Lydda and Saron saw him and turned to the Lord. Now there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and alms deeds which she did. And it came to pass in those days that she was sick and died, whom when they had washed, they laid her in an upper chamber. And forasmuch as Lydda was nigh to Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent unto him 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he was come, they brought him into the upper chamber. And all the widows stood by him weeping, and showing the coats and garments which Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all forth, and kneeled down and prayed, and turned him to the body, and said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand, and lifted her up, and when he had called the saints and widows, presented her alive. And it was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And it came to pass that he tarried many days in Joppa with one Simon, a tanner. So here we see Peter going throughout, as it says in the first verse we read, going throughout all quarters. He was going around and visiting all the different places, all the different churches, and was visiting with the different saints, the different people that had gathered themselves together, and he found himself in Lydda. Now when we read this, we read these things, and we see all these different miracles taking place. And I want us to also, before we go into the stories of miracles, I'm going to read real quick a short section out of Colossians chapter 3 as well, starting in verse 22. It says, Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. But he that doeth wrong shall receive the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. Now, do miracles really happen anymore? Do we believe that miracles are still happening today? You know, our passage this morning, the passage in Acts, shows us that miracles were actually fairly common in the early church. It was a commonplace thing. They happened, we read, and I don't know that it means necessarily what we would call as common, happening on an everyday basis, where they became lackadaisical about it, but they happened, and we have several documented stories of miracles happening in the early church. And as you read the Bible, the Bible itself is just full of miracles all through the ages, from the very beginning all the way on up through. And as we read the Bible stories and we see the different miracles, I know some of us might even form an opinion of what's our favorite miracle. And it might be interesting one day to sit down and find out and just ask a bunch of people, well, what was your favorite miracle in the Bible? You know, some might say, well, it was giving sight to the blind, and others might say it's healing the leopards. But I think it wouldn't be probably too far of a stretch to imagine that some of the most common favorites would be that of raising people from the dead, because that's just something that we really are fascinated by as human beings. We know that we think of death as a final thing, and to see this miracle of someone being risen from the dead, some of us might say that that's just speaks volumes of the power of God and the power of Jesus Christ that Peter had wielded right here. But have you ever noticed, though, today, in our society, in our vernacular, whenever time someone hears the word miracle, if you hear someone say, oh, well, there's miracles going on over here, there's miracles going on over there, sometimes our society, and even maybe even ourselves, we start to become suspicious and doubtful, and we kind of wonder what's going on about that. And it comes because we've seen or we've heard on the news of some high-profile evangelist that may have claimed to work miracles, and it turns out that he had been a fraud. That's what becomes prevalent in our news, and that's what people associate with miracles, with these miracle workers that have basically gone up and set up a stage show. And they've given true godly miracles a bad name. And we also live in a scientific age. We live in an age where science likes to proclaim that it can explain pretty much everything that goes on. We like to, the universities like to say that we understand how things happen now. A lot of times I read an article will come forth and say, oh, well, they've now proven that the Red Sea was simply split by a big gust of wind that come rushing through. And of course, when I read that, I say, yeah, so what? Is not God in control of that wind? Do you not think that even if it was a big gust of wind that came through that split the Red Sea, is that not a miraculous wind? Does God not use his own earthly devices to bring forth these miracles? When else have you ever seen a big gust of wind that's strong enough to split a sea in half? I think that's pretty miraculous, even if it was just a big, giant gust of wind. But it was the gust of wind at the breath of God. This is a miracle. But our society likes to think that we understand how everything works. We like to think that we know. But the question for us becomes this: do we believe in miracles today? Now, I'm not going to address that question right up front, but I want you to keep that question in mind as we go through the remainder of the service. Our passage today not only addresses the subject of miracles, but it also suggests that there are many different miracles that take place even in our ordinary lives that we may not even be cognizant of as they're going on in our lives. So when you take a look at this story, and we read this story of Peter walking about and healing of the palsy man, and then raising Dorcas or Tabitha from the dead, and you think, well, that might even make a good movie sometime. There's all kinds of good things going on there. We've got a real good storyline going on. It's a story of a community. It's a story of a person that even was a worker in the community, that gave back to the community. You see all these different subplots behind the scene with Tabitha and the widows behind the scene. We see this drama unfolding of this wonderful woman that's giving to the community, and as she passes on in her death. But then, of course, it's culminated at the mystery and the miraculous rescue when Peter comes in and gives the happy ending and brings her back from the dead. What a wonderful movie that would be, wouldn't it? We like to hear these wonderful stories, these happy endings. But as we look in this story, beneath the surface of this passage, we see several different hidden treasures for us as modern-day Christians to learn from. And among these hidden treasures is that, first of all, doing good to the poor, doing good to the Christian and the suffering, and all these different miracles have a wonderful effect on our community. We see this woman Tabitha and all the different things that she did for the community and how it was a wonderful thing, and it can show us what we can do as a Christian society to help those around us, as a Christian church. Now, Tabitha or Dorcas, I may interchange the names, so remember they are the one and the same. Tabitha is the Hebrew name. Dorcas is her Greek name. It's the same name, both meaning a doe or a deer. A female deer is basically what it means, referring to a gentle, giving creature. is what it is. But if you look at this story of Tabitha, she holds the distinction of being the only woman in the New Testament specifically referred to as a disciple. You know, there are men and women in groups that are referred to as disciples of Christ, but this is the only woman by name that is specifically referred to as a disciple by herself. Now, that's somewhat amazing. And so you think about it, it's a wonderful tribute to the things that this woman had done. That someone stood up and took notice of the wonderful things that she did. You know, verse 36, it says her ministry had been directed towards the poor and the outcasts of the community. She had a ministry for the widows. And this was a ministry long before we have all, you know, nowadays we see all kinds of different things. We have soup kitchens, we have Hope, and we have Salvation Army. We have all these different things in place. But Tabitha was already doing that before that became the norm. She had set up to where she would provide clothing for those that needed it. And Tabitha's ministry specifically was for the widows of Lydda and Joppa. Now, culturally speaking, you think about the widows. Why does the Bible tell us to take care of the widows? Because the widows in that day and age, in that culture, were outcasts. There was no one to take care of them. They were the bottom rung on the social society. So God had, on numerous occasions, had said that we're to provide for the widows. But unfortunately, as Christ had pointed out in several of his sermons, the Jews had taken through their traditions and made the commandments of God of none effect. And so oftentimes the taking care of widows got kind of pushed to the side and ignored. For example, if a Jew had said that, well, I can't give this to the widow because I've dedicated it to the service of God, even though he kept possession of it, I've dedicated it to the service of God, so therefore I don't have to give it to the widow. That's the traditions of men making the laws of God of none effect. So being a widow, especially if you were a childless widow in that day and age, was a very bad situation to be in. But here was someone, in this person of Tabitha, who took those commandments seriously. She was going to do her duty to take care of these widows. And without her ministry to that community, without that life-giving effort that she did, her work to those widows, and this community was going to take, if she was not there anymore, the community was going to suffer because of her absence. So when you think about it, for these widows, when they see the death of Tabitha, that was almost like a death blow to them. They knew that their support, what they were counting on to be there for them, was no longer there. And you see that's why they are there attending her and weeping over her when Peter comes in. Tabitha had kind of been their lifeline, their life preserver in a sea of bad situations. But Tabitha had a living witness that demonstrated the love of Jesus Christ towards these people. And her life showed that love in a very tangible way. You know, the Bible talks about don't see someone naked and just say, go off and be warmed. It says do something about it. And that's what Tabitha did. Tabitha did something about it. And so she stands for us as an example of how we should live our lives. How we should take the situations that God places us in and we should use them for God's service. You know, wherever it is we find ourselves, whoever our friends might be, whatever work or job we find ourselves in, those are the things we are to minister to, doing God's work. Now, in this passage I read out of Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, there it said that we are to work at everything we do with all of our heart because we're doing it for God. We're not doing it for our fellow man. We're doing everything we do for God. And sometimes, I know as we go about our daily lives and we do our work, sometimes we may become disillusioned with the work that we do. We may, whatever that work might be, we might get a little tired of it or upset about it or frustrated with it. And when we do this and we get into this frame of mind, we might get to the point where we think we're just going to do as little as we can get away with and still collect our paychecks. And when it comes down to it, though, we have to remind ourselves we're not working for that boss. We're not working for that company. We're working for the Lord, and we're to give him everything we have. You know, our whole lives, everything we do, every day, every aspect of our life is supposed to be lived as worship to the Lord. Our worship to the Lord is not just what we do here on Sunday. It's not what we do here in church. It's not just about being here in church, because God, while he cares about that, he really cares about more than that. He cares about everything that we do. He cares about everything that we say. He cares about everything that we think. And all of that needs to be done, and our lives need to be there, and we need to live our lives for his glory and to his praise. And Tabitha understood that. Tabitha had a grasp of that, and she lived her life that way. So, with Christ's help, we need to look to her as an example and do something for those around us. Now, the question for us then might become this: do we spend all of our time doing good and helping the poor like Tabitha? Well, this is an important question for us to ask. But doing all that, if you walk out these doors and that's all you take from this lesson, that I'm supposed to go do all I can for the poor, then you've probably missed the point, because doing all that we can for the poor isn't what makes us right with God. Yes, God has asked us to do that, and it's important that we do so. But again, we have to be reminded that we don't save ourselves. No matter of work that we can do, no matter of effort that we put out to help the poor is going to save us. But yet, James does tell us that faith without works is dead. We do need to have a living faith that produces something out there for others to see. Because Jesus did himself say, "By their fruits ye shall know them." So what does our fruit, and here's the question that each of us need to ask ourselves, what does my fruit say about me? Do people know who I am? Do people know the salvation of God that is in me by the fruit they see from me? Do I walk daily with the Lord? Am I obedient to what God asks me to do in his word? Do I help others when I have opportunity to do so? Those are the questions we ask ourselves. Now, 1 Peter 2, verse 11 says, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversations honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation." So then, why is it important for us to live obedient lives to God? Because as we do that, as we live obedient lives to God, and as we are helping others around us, others see Christ in us, and he is glorified. He gets the glory from that. And that's why we live a life pleasing to our Lord. Amen. Our good deeds or our obedience to God's way for our lives, that's done not to make us right with God, but instead to bring others to a faith in God. You know, as I think about this story, as I read this story, and I thought, Tabitha wasn't having a very good day. And I remember as a childhood, I like to read a lot of books. So I remember one of my favorite childhood books was Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. In this story, there's a little boy named Alexander, and he's just having a rotten day. The story tells of his traumatic experiences as Alexander gets up and he wakes up and there's chewing gum in his hair. And then he goes to eat his breakfast and there's no prize in his cereal box. And he doesn't get any dessert at lunchtime. And then he has to go to the dentist and have a filling done. And his mother serves him the most awful food later on in the day. And he gets soap in his eyes when he takes his bath. And to crown it all off, his little pet cat decides to go sleep with his brother instead of him. Boy, that was all one day. That was just bad, bad day. And I think all of us feel as if we've had days like that sometimes. And how do we come over, in all seriousness, how do we overcome those real difficulties in life when we have those bad days? What help does our faith offer to us? So I think perhaps maybe the most telling part of the story found in today's Bible passage concerns the description provided for Tabitha. Yeah, she was having a bad day. But Tabitha was a disciple who she got sick and she died. Now, when they described Tabitha, she was described as being full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. I found it interesting that they added that last phrase, full of good works and alms deeds. That to me that would be enough to say. But they added this last phrase on the end, which she did. And to think about that from even my perspective in my life, how many times have there been good deeds that I have done? As opposed to, let's look at why I say that's so important. How many other times have there been lots of good deeds that I've talked about doing, but didn't really do? How many times have there been lots of good deeds that I got started with, but I never finished? And how many times in my life have there been lots of good deeds that I had an idea about and I asked someone else if they would do it? But that's not what it says here about Tabitha. They were full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. She did them. This was a person who was faithful to the cause of Christ. She was kind and gracious in her acts towards other people. She meant what she said. She was just the kind of person that the early church needed in their wings. She's just the kind of person that any church would be blessed to have. Just like Brother Earl talked about this morning, people that step in and do what's necessary. But why then did she have to die? Of all the people, why did the church have to lose this beloved saint to death? This wonderful woman Tabitha, who did all those good things for all these people, she became ill and she died. Why did she have to suffer like that? We might want to ask ourselves. Sometimes we find ourselves asking questions like that when troublesome times come our way. Well, why did it happen? Did God want to teach her something through this? Was it God's will? Well, I tend to believe by the conclusion of the story that the answer to both those questions is no. However, God used her death. God didn't necessarily send her sickness, but he used it. I heard once a pastor say, when he was talking about Romans 8, we all know about Romans 8:28, everything works together for good than the love of the Lord. But one pastor had once said, he said, everything is either God sent or God used. And as he went on to talk about all the blessings and opportunities that God sends us, and then he followed this up by talking about some other things. He said this, that God still uses everything that comes to us, even if it doesn't come from him. Some evils come in our life simply because of sin in the lives of others, or even sin in our own lives. God may not have sent it to us, but he uses it in us. God uses the most everyday of things for his own good and his own purposes. And this verse doesn't say that God will, when you read 8:28, all things work together for good that them that love God. This verse doesn't say that God will only work together for good the things that he sent to us, but it says everything. Every situation we find ourselves in our lives in, whether it be of our own, because of our own mistakes or not, God can use it. Suffering then in our lives could probably be best described as God used most of the time. A lot of the suffering in this world comes because of the sin-sick state of this world. And God uses that. God doesn't necessarily send it to us, but he allows it in our lives to teach us something. And we can expect, though, suffering in our lives if we are to really, truly follow God. If we are to be given over to Jesus Christ, you can expect there's going to be some suffering in your life. Whenever the church is most active, whenever you find yourself most on fire for God, that's when you're going to find Satan's going to try and come at you. And you can expect some things in your life. You know, throughout the world, the church is becoming more and more active. And as this happens, more and more Christians are suffering, some of them even to death. You know, we've had twice that I can remember, we've had a gentleman come here and visit about people in the Middle East that are being killed because they're professing faith in Jesus Christ. You know, we're kind of distanced from that here in America. But it really is happening. And as the Word of God is spreading farther to the world, more and more people are suffering because of their belief in Jesus Christ. You know, some statistics say, I wish I had more up-to-date statistics, but I read a statistic about in 1999. I mean, this is 11 years ago. And I can only imagine it's grown since then. Approximately 164,000 people were killed because of their professed faith in Jesus Christ. You read that, and that just speaks volumes for how active the church is and how active Satan is to battle the church. But some of us, all of us, if we truly are letting our Christian side show, if we are not keeping it under a bushel as we're not supposed to, if we are living a life that Christ wants us to live, we should expect there should be some kind of suffering. It may be simply just pointed fingers and a little ridicule of maybe friends and family, but it could take all the way to the extreme. But now as we look in this, in the midst of all this, great things can still happen. Because God is not limited by the suffering that we go through. God is not even limited by illness or death. And we can turn to God for hope in all of our suffering because He is our rock and He is our fortress. We know that God works everything together for good for those who love Him. So if we're going to love God and we're going to live a life pleasing to Him, then we can know that everything we go through works together for our good. And we do love Him, don't we? And if we do, then we should expect. We need to take His word serious. If we really love Him and it says it works together for our good, then we need to believe that. And we should live our life as if we do believe that. Now Dorcas, Tabitha, she loved the Lord, and He worked everything, including her death, together for good in her life and in the life of the church. You know, in the passage, we see the good that God worked through this situation. It says, Peter went into the room where Tabitha's body was laid, and he put out all those that had accepted that she was already dead, those that had pretty much given her up. He put them all out the door, and he prayed. I find it interesting how it says that he prayed and then he turned to the body. It's almost as if Peter needed a little bit of courage himself so he wouldn't look at the dead body while he was praying for it to come back to life. Because he wanted to have his focus on Jesus Christ and his faith in the Lord. But he prayed, and then he turns to the body and tells her to get up, which she did. This should be our pattern when we are faced with illness or injury in our lives. Now, I'm not saying don't go to the doctor. I'm not going to go crazy and say that, I'm not going to jump onto that bandwagon that say all of our illnesses are because of sin in our life and we should just get right with God and you won't be sick. The doctors have their place. But I am saying that we should pray when we're sick or when we're hurt. We should pray for healing. Because God may very well use that doctor down the street to make us better, but He might intercede on our behalf in a supernatural way as well. We have to believe that He still has the power to do so, which He does. God is still in control of this world. He still has control of everything that happens in our lives. And when we look at verse 42 in our passage, we can see the importance of this work. How important was it? It says that it was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Many believed in the Lord. These miracles, all miracles performed by Christ, which even though Peter was the instrument here in this story, these miracles were performed by Christ. They always have. Anytime you study the New Testament, you will see that miracles performed by Christ always have the purpose of either inciting or affirming faith. That's their purpose. And it served its purpose here. Through these miracles that Peter did, and here we get to the point of the lesson, the greatest miracle of all was propagated throughout that region. Because the greatest miracle for us is the forgiveness of sin. That wonderful change that overcomes a person that comes to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. The different life that you see someone live once Christ comes into their life. That, to me, is the greatest miracle of all. The changing of a life, the taking of something lost, something eternally dead, and making it eternally alive. That's the greatest miracle of all. Now, we have the power in us. We have that power. You know, the apostles, when Christ sent them out, he endowed them with the power to perform miracles of healing. Now, we may not be endowed with that power, but we do have the power to spread the greatest miracle of all to those around us. We can spread that. And we need to let it affect our lives. We need its effect on our lives to be so evident in the way that we live, the way that we speak, the way that we act. Because just like our story started today, just like that, it was the evidence of the miracles that worked the greatest good. So if that evidence of that greatest miracle of all can be seen in us, then it will do the greatest good. So let our lives show the evidence of that miracle worked in us, and let us all share the gospel and spread the greatest miracle of all. Let's stand and let's be dismissed in a word of prayer.